Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Diane Harris. I'm Dean of the College of Humanities, and I'm delighted to be welcoming Dan Whaley to our campus this afternoon. And I'm just going to give Dan a sort of an informal introduction. I've known Dan for a little while. We first met when I was director of the Humanities Center at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, where Dan has his undergraduate degree in English. But I first met Dan actually at a small meeting that was convened by the Mellon Foundation to talk about digital humanities and the future of several digital humanities projects. Learned a little bit more about Hypothesis after that and became very enthusiastic about it. But before I say a little bit more about that, I'll just say again, Dan has an English degree from the University of Illinois. And he then went on to do some incredibly important innovations in the digital world, like inventing the first travel reservation platform and also, I believe, the first e-commerce platform on the web. So these are kind of major innovations that have impacted all of our lives every day since that happened. And it's also exciting to me to think about how someone with an English degree then takes their knowledge of the kinds of things that we teach students to do in an English department, close reading, learning and understanding of how people think about how humans interact with the worlds around them, the kinds of things that matter to us in the humanities, and then can take that knowledge and parlay it into building the kinds of tools that are incredibly important in our everyday lives and that probably, I'm going to venture to say, would not be as useful to us if they were not designed by someone who had the kind of depth and breadth of understanding that Dan has, I think, because he also comes from a background in the humanities. So it's just a delight to have him here with us today. I really wanted Dan to come because although I have not yet had the opportunity, I've been doing administration mostly since I met Dan and learned about Hypothesis, but I'm very, very convinced that this is a tool that has the potential to shape the way we work in higher ed more than almost any other innovation in the digital humanities or in the digital world, because I think it offers the potential for new pedagogical practices, really innovative pedagogical practices, which some of our faculty are already pioneering, but also new modes of collaboration among scholars. At a time when being able to work together to produce critical commentary that's also authoritative commentary on any content that's out there on the web is more important than ever before. So with that, I won't take up any more time. I'm going to let Dan come up here and tell us about this wonderful tool. Great. So welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Diane. Thanks, everybody. This is what I'm going to talk about. So thanks for having me. It's great to be here. It's my first time at the U of U, or U squared, or whatever you guys affectionately refer to it as here. And super impressed by all the stuff that's going on. I got to see the new DH Matter, or the Digital Matter group. Thanks, Rebecca and everybody. University experience has come a long way since I have been in one, so it's really exciting to see what's going on. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a very interesting new project. Some of you may have heard about it, an interesting new paradigm, and why I decided to kind of divert from for-profit world into this area, and a little bit about what's happening and what you guys might expect to see over the next couple of years. So I work with a nonprofit called Hypothesis. We have about 15 people. I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. And we have a vision within the scholarly world, which is essentially to bring an open, collaborative layer over all knowledge and all the things and bits and pieces that make up knowledge in terms of articles and books and images and art and media and so forth that effectively are all on the web now. The amount of undigitized information that's still not on the web is getting smaller and smaller. You guys are an active part of HathiTrust and continuing to scan your archives, and we're getting to the point where it's basically all on there. and certainly the most important parts in terms of what they mean for our daily lives. So we think, and the reason why Hypothesis is a nonprofit is that it's super important that this technology be open, based on standards, and really built for the long term in terms of what it can mean for all of us. And the plan in terms of how to do that, in a nutshell, is really to partner with the world's great publishers, libraries, platforms like ORCID and Internet Archive and HathiTrust and so forth to develop, design, and roll out this platform so that you guys can all use it. So the problem statement is kind of like, here's an article, and it's been published. Actually, I think this is on archive, so technically it hasn't been published, but it's basically gone to die. Somebody may cite it at some point later, and then we'll continue to kind of have a life, in the citation history of a paper. But there's no way for you to see anything really about what other people think about this, unless you can maybe Google, unless it's been cited, perhaps, and then you can see what other actual formal papers are saying about it or how they're referring to it. You could Google the title and see whether maybe Google might get lucky and give you like a blog post about it or something like that. But you can't see on the article, like a heads-up display or something, what other people think. You can't see if there's been a correction. You can't see if there's been a retraction. You can't see if somebody tried to reproduce an experiment at a different temperature, and the author of the paper responded and said, oh no, try 85 degrees instead of 83 degrees. So there's a lot of information that you're lacking because of the way publishing works and has worked for a very long time. So there's been a vision for how this might be different that goes way, way, way back. Some of the earliest people that cite early influencers point to Vannevar Bush, who was the first head of the Office of Naval Research and Time Man of the Year in 1943, and really a big thinker about information, imagined the web and how we might get here. And he imagined that, he kind of conceived of the concept of Wikipedia, this collaborative thing, even before the infrastructure to create that thing might be possible. But he really first talked about this idea that all of us together might come collaboratively and create trails through knowledge, sharing our perspectives on the things that are out there, in addition to just sharing the things that are out there. In Tim Berners-Lee, in his kind of rough proposal for the web in 1989, one of the foundational 9 principles of the web that he wanted to create was that it should be able to be annotated, surprisingly. Not only the nodes, the pages, but also the links between the pages. And those two things, surprisingly, are the 2 fundamental design principles today of the way that annotation has been imagined to work. In 1993, Mark Andresen, former U of I alum, who many of you may know created the first graphical web browser called Mosaic, and then later he moved to Silicon Valley and started a company called Netscape, which is now essentially the spiritual origin of Mozilla, which brings us Firefox. So he put out in 1993 a note on a bulletin board saying, hey, I'm going to start a group annotation server and build it into Mosaic. And so they did that. They turned it on for about a month, and so that the only browser that everybody was using back then was able to annotate every page on the web, and you were able to see the annotations in groups of people that you wanted to join with, and then they turned it off. And he's written a blog post recently about how much he regrets that, even though they didn't have the funding or the resources or whatever to be able to run this server that would have to scale to web scale with every page, new page that was added, he still regrets not having this 25-year history of layers of annotations and thinking on top of this web. So what we've gotten instead is this thing called the comment widget, which is down there at the bottom of pages. It's really terrible. It's first of all, it's kind of below the fold as an afterthought at the bottom. It's implemented by the publisher. It's their agent, their vehicle, not your vehicle. It's all proprietary tech. There are no open source implementations of commenting systems that anybody uses. It's a haven for trolls. It's poorly moderated and poorly really conceived as a way to generate high quality signal versus low quality. So, but the other big problem is it's only on pages where it's implemented. So most of the web is quiet. You go there, you see the page, but you don't see any activity or thinking around it. If you want to see that, you go somewhere else. You go to Facebook, or you go to Reddit, or you check Twitter to see if anybody's pasted the URL in there and what they might have to say about it. So we have an interesting technology that's been with us for a very, very, very long time called the annotation. The Talmud and illuminated manuscripts from the Middle Ages have these things, and the reason why people started doing them is because they were useful. That placed the thinking of a person. They didn't really mind scribbling in books back then too much. So it was a way to layer thinking from other people as a kind of a living guide and a living legend as people went. There are other solutions out there. In the more of the STEM areas, people might be familiar with services like ResearchGate and Mendeley and academia.edu, where you can take a document and you can upload it and you can have a collaborative conversation there. That's really kind of forking the content. Like you gotta still do it over there. You can't really discover it where it is. So the idea, the promise is to build the capability to have, number one, annotation, and number two, the most important thing is layers of annotation on top of the world around us. Layers for any purpose that you might want, for personal use, for classrooms, for small groups, for public channels, specialty communities that annotate for a specific purpose. Machine annotation is something that we're seeing a tremendous amount of interest in. So lots of different groups want to create machine reading systems that will take and process, do entity extraction, create annotated service layers that may be a benefit for many folks. So these annotations, like I said, lots of layers, lots of purposes. And the other thing that's really important about the way that people have come together to conceive of this is that these layers of annotation can come from different servers. So this is not a monolithic new Twitter where all tweets went through Twitter or Google Docs or something like that. This is kind of like the web where anybody can run a server, anybody can build the client software that would be able to see these annotations or render them. And that way you can have a user interface control or paradigm that lets you see different layers, and those different layers can be coming from different places. This is all based on a new web standard as of February this year, the W3C, which is the standards body for the web, so they determine how HTML and CSS and other things like that get extended, has ended a 4-year process of bringing this technology called web annotations through to formal approval. And this means the most important thing is that people, number one, can have a shared understanding of how to build these technologies in a way that will be interoperable, number one, and number two, that browsers can start to build this stuff in natively, so that your browser will come built in with the capability to create and anchor annotations, and that you'll have the freedom as a browser user to plug in whatever servers you want to be asking for relevant annotations on the pages that you go to. Not to get too geeky, but annotation in W3 speak involves 4 things that we commonly know of as discrete concepts. They're actually simply permutations of the annotation model. So an annotation is the fully specified thing. It's got a note, it points to a page, and then it points inside the page to a bit of text. A comment doesn't point inside the page, it's just a page level thing. A highlight points inside to a sentence, but it doesn't say anything, it just highlights that. So, and then bookmarks don't point in and don't carry any text, but they mark a book or a page or a document in a way that we can save and archive and access later. We can start to tag all of the bookmarks that we make in the same tag structure that we're using to make annotations or highlights or comments. And being able to combine these things in a fluid, single data model, very, very, very powerful. So the class of applications that are kind of in the crosshairs of this new paradigm are things like note-taking, things like tagging, Digo, Delicious, Pinboard, things like discussion, Reddit, Facebook, Twitter, and bookmarking stuff that tends to come natively inside your browser. The goal of the W3C paradigm supports is format agnostic. All it needs is a selection to be specified for the particular data type. So text, epubs, which are text, images, video, data, you name it. So we'll show you some examples. My goal, I'm going to try to speed through this and get to the demo and kind of show you actually how it works. So we're a nonprofit, like I said, funded through support of Mellon, Omidyar, Sloan, Helmsley, Shuttleworth, Knight Foundation, who we are very thankful. We have a team of about 15. All we do is annotation. It's about half software developers and half program staff that help focus in verticals in adoption. And the goal is, for us is to be shared neutral infrastructure, both from a services point of view to the point where people want us to run or host their annotations, but also from a code point of view, to produce the absolute best of breed open source implementation, reference implementation of this new technology, and to partner broadly and protect and preserve this paradigm to the best that our organization can do that in a way that aligns long term with users. We do run a service ourselves at Hypothesis. You can go to our website, you can get a user account, you can start annotating the web right now. We have about 100,000 users. We're on track for about 2 million annotations by the end of the year. About a quarter of the annotations are public. Other people can see them. 50% of them are in private groups, so for classroom use, or a bunch of authors are making notes. Sometimes people make groups just for themselves to help organize things. And then 24, the rest are personal, private notes, just personal use. So what's, we trying to think of what is going to drive the next billion annotations, which we think will start to happen very rapidly. So there's some things I'll talk about in a little bit. Number one is true federation of the client. Our client right now is still single server. By the end of this year, we'll have extended the client to be able to listen to any server, any compliant annotation server, including multiple servers simultaneously. So you'll be able to log into 2 or 3 servers. Like your company might run one behind their firewall, where you're creating company confidential notes and collaborations. At the same time, you're listening to see on that piece of case law whether there were any private or public observations. And then the client will also be able to automatically discover new servers as you go around the web. So the page might say, there's a server over here that has authoritative annotations for this content, and the client will automatically go connect to that server and pull them in. So it's really interesting for publishers and other kinds of use cases. Publishers, platforms, integration is the key, really, from our perspective to use, making sure we support every format. I mean, you should not be able to essentially encounter something on the web that you can't reach into and annotate. That Google Doc, you should be able to annotate that. Even though it's got a commenting system, being able to use yours means that you can annotate against your account or with the same group structure that you used on that web page over there. So the goal is to break apart these silos so that you've got that same fluid, powerful capability everywhere. Spotify, you're storing, or Shazam, What are you doing when you're tagging all those songs? You're annotating them. Who's got that data? Shazam. How come you can't plug your annotation data store into Shazam and then tell Spotify to listen to that as your structure of tracks? The promise out here is to start to use these open paradigms to start to break apart these silos. They're providing useful services, but these are very brittle systems, ecosystems, that aren't a good long-term architecture for humanity to do all the things we want to do. So a couple years ago, we've pulled together a consortium of first scholarly and educational publishers that have agreed to start integrating this. So JSTOR, Elsevier, Whaley, HathiTrust, Archive, PLOS, most of the large publishers are part of this now, and we're beginning to roll out the integrations into their platforms. Yesterday, we just announced MIT Press. We'll be announcing NYU Press and a few others, and some of the other larger ones are very near to announcements as well. And we also run a large workshop every year called I Annotate with about 150 people that come together to do hack and share stories and have a good time. So annotation is useful for a lot of things. Here's some user stories. I'm going to dive down into some of these, but there's a lot of different kinds of ways that you can use annotation. Let me kind of power through a couple of these. So the classic use case, kind of the equivalent of comments on the web, is post-publication discussion. So here's somebody who's annotated an article at Archive, the same article I showed you before, and his research was cited in this article, and so he's gone in and said, hey, it's really great that, thanks for citing my work, but, folks might also want to look at this other one. And goes on to make a few other notes in the preprint. Very interesting use case for preprints because they're not peer reviewed, but potentially collaborative annotation on top of them can be a way for the article to improve, perhaps on the way to publication. Here's an example of a researcher who is one of the co-authors of the paper, who's gone and later and annotated their own work to talk about some additional projects that they're working on. So this is good. One of the most authoritative people about a paper is, of course, the author. So how come they can't go back and provide, have a system that's completely within their control outside the publisher, which lets them provide additional context as corrections and so forth as time goes on. Publisher layers are something we're seeing an absolute tremendous amount of interest in. So, the journals are kind of like, well, this is interesting, but I don't really want to stick this thing on my journal and just invite, kind of conversations and discussion that I can't moderate. So but on the users, on the other hand, want to be able to go to that article and basically annotate and not necessarily be moderated by the publisher, and bring all their communities and groups and everything with them. So how do you solve this standoff? Well, the architecture kind of lends itself to the solution, which is that the publisher can specify in the page template for the article an authoritative server for that article, and the interface will show that server, and this is an article by eLife. eLife is about to roll out this technology. They're an open access life sciences journal. And so here the eLife discussion layer is on top. If you're not logged into Hypothesis, you won't see that there are any other annotation layers. So the casual person who doesn't even know about this will only see the kind of publisher-sponsored and moderated discussion. So eLife will have full moderation rights over that layer that they control. But if the person wants to sign in, create an account, and go create groups or have a general discussion, they can. And interestingly, publishers have been okay with this compromise, where they're, until the person knows about it, their layers are the only ones that are shown. Peer review, I'll show you some more slides on this later. We have a big announcement this week. This technology is starting to be integrated into submission workflow systems. So eJournal Press, which is one of the submission workflows that journals use. You can, instead of writing a long form review in a Microsoft Word document where you say on page 3 in section 2, I had this note, you can just go annotate it. And those annotations flow into the eJournal Press system, but they're all formatted with the open standard, and the editors now can selectively go in and take interesting conversations and publish them as a layer that will flow along and be visible on the actual eventual published article. So this is an area that we're pretty interested in. Entity annotation is one. I'm going to talk about a little bit more about this later. Illuminated footnotes, so bringing interesting information in the citation, the footnotes, or the bibliography forward, so that you can kind of see what's being talked about, see whether it might be interesting, and then click straight through to that document wherever it is without having to go to Google. Journal clubs, we've got a bunch of journal clubs now, so instead of just having to get together in person to talk about those 3 papers on Thursday night, you can get together, but then they might send the 3 papers out at the beginning of the week, and you can start to read them and start to make notes in that private layer in ways that is confident, kind of protected and private to the journal clubs, especially if you're an early career researcher. You're able, you can ask that dumb question that maybe would have been obvious if you were 10 years further into your career, and do exactly what journal clubs are about, which is learning more about science. And then the classroom use. So we're seeing a lot, 60% of our use right now in classrooms, who the teacher will assign a bunch of material, and then the students can come and help each other, basically ask questions about that material, and the teacher can see, what are people struggling with? How should I spend my time when we all come together, during class? We're starting to build shims for all the LMS systems. We have an alpha shim for Canvas, so you can drag and drop the material straight out of what you've already put into Canvas, and wrap it with the hypothesis interface, and assign a group for the class, just so if you have different sections or whatever, they can all be in their own space. But then if you want to teach something that you didn't put in the LMS, the students can just grab the extension and go to whatever New York Times article it was. That same group that you've created inside the Canvas environment will be available, so it's a great way to kind of start to blend the boundaries between these systems that have been very siloed. For instance, I don't know if you guys use Ex Libris here as a interface to library resources, but Ex Libris kind of has its own user interface. Canvas has its own user interface. There's shims between them, but they still don't really work like a single system. Here you'd be able to see, no matter where you enter the library resource, through ProQuest, through Ex Libris or whatever, to the document, you'd be able to see the same annotations in the same layers that you were interested in. Another interesting use case we're seeing is our community. So here the idea is, what if we were able to take the combined expertise of the world's most knowledgeable people and deploy it really as a public service over knowledge news and so forth. So we have a class of folks called professional fact checkers, Snopes, PolitiFact, etc. Very small, understaffed. And then we've got another group of really enormous group of folks, which is really everybody that knows any, special experts in their field. Much more credible. As soon as folks see Snopes, some people go, "Oh, great, that's what Snopes had to say." Other people go, "Oh, Snopes, right? I don't know those guys." But if it's the people that really know the world's experts on the Zika virus, they've got a lot more agency and credibility because they're specialists, and that's what they do all day. So there's a group, interesting group called Climate Feedback. This is a group out of Berkeley. They run their own annotation layer, and they annotate climate news and rate it. So this is, some article in the Telegraph. They've come along and said, and the article in the Telegraph might have quoted a few recent studies. Climate Feedback, because they're, the world's top climate scientists, they'll just go find the guy that wrote the article that was cited, bring him into the annotating group, and have him, or her, point out, whether this was accurate or not, or what the nuance was that was lost in translation. So we're super excited about this paradigm of communities. We're about to launch our communities initiative this fall to bring more of these folks on. And we asked ourselves, what might the next 100 communities be? I mean, you can imagine specialty communities on constitutional law that would annotate, leaked drafts of stuff coming out of subcommittee in Washington, or folks that have, a lot of experience in cybersecurity or hurricanes or whatever it is. If you're on a page where one of these communities has agency, you might all of a sudden see there might be a little alert that says, hey, this high-profile group that a lot of people are following with a high credibility score is annotating. Do you want to see that specific layer? Giving communities layers gives them agency, allows them to control their voice, whereas typically in comment widgets, they're the first to leave because the lowest common denominator basically controls the conversation. So let me show you kind of how it works. So I was going to be all cool and come up with a digital humanities example here, but let me just use a Springer article on, this is an open access article on earthquakes. And so this capability is not implemented at Springer. This is just an article that's in my browser. I can turn on the Chrome extension, which is one of 4 ways you can bring the annotation technology to a page. And then I can come along and annotate. So let me go to, I can go to the public channel, for instance, and I can say, hopefully I would say something quite interesting, other than just that's interesting, and make a note. And so there it is. The annotation is stuck to that piece of text. I can go along, make another one down here, and so now there's 2 annotations. So, and I can use the cards to kind of browse the page to take me to where those annotations are. I can grab a link to any annotation anywhere on any document and then immediately share it with somebody like that, put it out in a tweet, embed it as a link in a text, and then it takes them straight to that article. Even if they don't have the annotation technology, they're not aware of it. They haven't downloaded the extension or anything. That's how that works. And then if, for instance, let me go to download the PDF. So here's the same article in PDF form. I turn on the extension and the annotations that I made are automatically in the right place on the PDF. So the technology knows it can read all the metadata on the page. It knows what the DOI is, what all the URLs that are in well-formed scholarly articles are in the metadata behind the page, and it automatically says, oh, this PDF is this article, and pulls them over. And I can go backwards the other way here, so I can annotate here and say, hey, and then wait, this is here. There's a new annotation on the page. I can pull it down, and there's my annotation on that part of the HTML that came from the PDF side. And it works on the fingerprints of PDF. So one of the really cool things is, harder to demo here, but I can take this PDF and save it to my desktop, however I do that, and email it to you, and you can pull it from your email into your browser, turn on Hypothesis, and you'll see all the annotations on it, because it doesn't even need a URL. It can go just off the binary hash that's native to all PDFs. So that means that, that whole corpus of scholarly articles that, you've been saving for whatever reason on your hard drive, for carrying them around as you move your computer, or storing them in Dropbox or something like that, you can see the annotations on those without having to go back to the original version, and so forth. Another thing that we're really interested in is data. So here's a CSV file somewhere on the web that this one happens to be a list of publicly traded companies and little bits and pieces of data on them. So if I drag this into the hypothesis annotator like this, it turns it into takes the CSV file, runs it in an HTML table, and then I can just go annotate the data. So actually, I forgot one thing I was gonna show you. So let me, instead of annotating in the public channel, let me create a group. So I can create a group very easily. So let's click this group, earthquakes. And now this group called earthquakes that I just made is available to me, and I can create an annotation here, and I can tag it, quake 1, and then maybe I can make another annotation here, tag this one like this, and call it quake 2. And maybe some, Italy, and I could, make an annotation on the HTML version. Again, go back to my earthquake group, like so. Looks like it made some other annotations in this group before on this document. Make another tag. And so these groups, this group becomes a way for me to start to accumulate annotations on documents wherever I go, and it works across formats. So that CSV file I can now also annotate here like this. We'll call this data annotation for quake 1. I could link to this, grab the link to this annotation maybe, and maybe link one annotation to another. Check out this data. So make that a hypertext link that points to the annotation I just made. So now I've taken this piece of an article and I've linked it straight to directly into a CSV file. And when I link there, it actually scrolls me over to that cell, puts me into that group, and shows me that annotation. So we can start to link, annotate the links between nodes, as Tim Berners-Lee was imagining. So one of the things we've been working very hard on is getting the next format in place. So earlier in the year, we had wanted to do EPUBs for a long time. EPUBs are pretty tricky. They're HTML, but they're all zipped up, and they got spines and weird ways to. They're all reflowable, so there's no one single page. It's like the reader dictates what the pages are that you see. special, creates all kinds of special considerations. So there's two primary open source EPUB frameworks. One's called Redium.js that was created by the group called IDPF, which owns now part of the W3C, which kind of manages the EPUB spec. And then there's another wildly popular framework called epubjs. So we partnered with both of those groups and NYU Press, and then integrated with those two frameworks. So as of this last week, I can take an EPUB. So I'll take this really interesting one called 100 Proofs That the Earth is Not a Globe. And here's a little EPUB from Project Gutenberg. And then I can drag and drop it onto our little test site. So this is a way to get, whoops, that's not the test site. So here it is. Now it's in epubjs, and I can flip through it like a book. And I could embed this book on a page in a frame, packaged with the reader if I wanted to, if I was running a press or a library where all of our titles were available. Some of them might be behind DRM and watermarked and so forth, or some of them might be open access. And then I can annotate them. Oops. Oh, I knew this was, oh, we get a little bug. Anyway, let me annotate the book. This was working this morning, but broken yesterday, so I was hoping. Anyway, you can see that my group, the context is still here from across the web that I've been annotating with a bunch of people. I can make an annotation in this book on that page, as pulled from that particular press, and stick it there and organize it with tags and so forth, and set this and use that, have that context with me wherever I'm going. Annotations. Show you one other thing really quick that's kind of interesting. Annotations don't have to be just text. You can also stick cool things in them, like if I want to stick, for instance, a video. Let's stick a video in that annotation. And so there I've got a YouTube video that I can play right from the annotation card. Annotations can also have like math in them. So you can say I want to put some LaTeX in there. So there's an equation which is fully selectable and annotatable itself. We're expanding the media formats. We've just expanded the framework so that you can go to the Internet Archive's TV News archive, which some of you may be familiar with. So they've been recording 60 channels of video for the last 12 or 15 years now. And you can get any snippet of anything that's been on CNN for the last 10 years, and you can dive down into 30-second bit where somebody says something about something else and drop that right in an annotation card, for instance, as a way to kind of annotate with media. So let me kind of go back to our browsing interface. So this was my group here, the earthquake group. I've annotated a few more things. Here was the data table that I was annotating. Here are the tags that I was using. So if I want to narrow the document, this is a faceted search, so I can add the data tag up there and just look at the one annotation that was tagged data. I can see all the members that were in this group, so it's just me to begin with. So if I click on my member name, then I can scope, again, the search query by by a particular user and a tag and a group. I can just look at all of my annotations, so I can go to my user profile. These are, the 1,200 annotations I've made over the last few years, in all kinds of documents, and I can go and just go there from any document, any annotation I've made. I can always click and go straight back to the document, scroll right to the place. People can come along and reply to the annotations. This is a fully threaded model. If somebody wants to come along and say something to that, I will get a notification that somebody's replied to my annotation anywhere on the web. There's a lot of interesting things that you can start to build with this. So here's a project called SciBot. SciBot is a project of the Neuroscience Information Framework at UCSD. They've created an annotating robot that goes and pulls a new kind, scans the scholarly literature for a new kind of identifier. And the identifier is called an RRID. So let's go look at one of these. So I'll click on that annotation card. And here's an article in PubMed Central on something high-fat diets. And this RRID, the biologists have created over the last couple of years because these articles are mentioning all these things like antibodies and reagents that were very specific down to the manufacturer. Like if you wanted to reproduce the experiment, you'd have to actually know. But that information wasn't in the article. So what they did was come up with an identification scheme like a DOI. Those are now embedded in articles. And now the SciBot goes and annotates every RRID in every article that comes out so that instead of having to cut and paste that and put it into Google, you can just click on it and see which manufacturer created this. You can see all the other articles that it was mentioned in, and you can click on it, and you can see all the other articles that were tagged with that particular RRID. So you can kind of start to use that as an easy way to pivot through the literature. And this use of tags is a really, really powerful thing that that a lot of people are starting to leverage. We're about to release maybe a little bit later next year a structured tag capability, so you'll be able to load a reference external controlled vocabularies or dictionaries that communities maintain and so forth. Let's see, another interesting project, the Syracuse Qualitative Data Repository is starting to form partnerships with publishers to where whenever a Syracuse, a piece of evidence in an article that's published that points to something that was stored with the Syracuse repository, they'll annotate the, let's find a good example here. They'll annotate the area, the place where that citation was mentioned in the article, and show you the thumbnail of the element that's stored in QDR. You can read a little bit about it. This is actually in Spanish, so you can see the Spanish and the translation of it. And then you can go there. You can go to the actual document as stored at the repository and read it. But you'll click on it knowing what you're going to and knowing most of the relevant information about it ahead of time. So that's pretty interesting. We're seeing a lot of potential for this. Publishers are very interested in kind of enhancing their articles with these different kinds of more structured machine-driven annotations. The eJournal Press integration I talked about. Let's just show you kind of the simple few slides here. So basically what they wanted to be able to do was allow reviewers, editors, authors to mark up manuscripts, implement all the blinding requirements for the review model that's in place, override the tag editor with their structured tags to classify the different kinds of interventions, to be able to filter by all that stuff and have it stored in their database. So here now, as of this week, AGU, which was kind of the co-development partner with us, and eJournal Press, is rolling this out to all 19 of their journals, so that the reviewers can annotate if they want to do an annotated review. Can click on that. This is kind of a little bit backwards, but they'll come to the manuscript. They'll see the annotations. If they're the editor, so this is kind of the editor's view, the editor can see that as a reviewer and who the person is, what was said, the tags, whether it was a major comment or a minor one, etc., whether or not the annotation is something that should not be shown to authors, or something that can be shown to authors. They can filter the annotations through the scope control by any of these different parameters. For the reviewers, it's easy to create the annotation kind of in the same way that you do already. Just add whatever you need. All the capabilities of the editor are there. They can use YouTube videos or math or whatever. They can file that away. Decision letters that have all that information are automatically generated and created into a PDF so they can be sent to authors, and so forth. So that is the review stuff. I'll cut it, just end it there. I've kind of already explained that stuff, and take your questions.
I have a question in the comment section. What if there's a scholarly article on climate change, and someone goes in and just throws a bunch of junk or bad science at it? Is there a way for the author to remove that?
So
or
that's
to challenge it? I mean,
right.
I see great things with this, but I can also see bad things like that happening.
Yeah, so there's really, the goal of having lots of layers with lots of potential communities moderating them is specifically to address that problem, which is, the biggest problem. And the one channel that is unique amongst all of them is the one we call public, which is the channel that's visible by default. So right now we've been existing in a kind of a beautiful paradise where this is still all relatively early adopters. We have a set of community guidelines. We enforce them. Occasionally people break them, and we address that and either turn off the annotation to where it's just visible to them. We don't delete it. We just make it private. Or we, if it's a problem person, then we'll, kind of terminate there, or kind of make all of their annotations private. So they can still continue to use the service to make personal notes or whatever, but nobody else can see them. And they can participate in private groups, but they can't participate in the public channel. So the question that we have is, how long are we going to be able to, clearly in order to scale this further, we'll have to pull the community in to do community-based moderation. We have to build a set of tools to enable that. For us, whether or not we can continue to have the public channel operate and provide its functionality is an open question. It's experimental hypothesis. We know that Wikipedia's got some fantastic approaches that have been relatively successful to do this. We know it's possible. We have a very strong advantage in that because we're a nonprofit, we don't have to generate commercial revenue by pumping numbers and generating ads. So we're not naturally disposed to allow anybody to say anything because of that outcome. So for us, from our perspective, annotation is a privilege, not a right in the public channel. And the great thing about the architecture is if you want to just create a really terrible place for anybody to say anything, you can go start your own annotation server and run that, and people can subscribe to it, and maybe they will. There are certainly places like that on the web. So that's the simple answer.
Being able to create these communities and bring your community to wherever you browse on the web, right? That's really what I think that's what's most robust about this platform, rather than just going to a social media site and having your community just post stuff from the web. So you bring your community to the web rather than your community bringing the web to you, right? But relate to, I'm sorry, what was your name again? Peter's question was a concern of mine with regards to the balkanization of the web, right? So what is to stop a bunch of community members who use Hypothesis who are interested in denying climate science or anti-vaccination and just subscribing to that channel and bringing that kind of discourse to wherever they browse on the web, right? I mean, is that something that you guys have thought about?
Absolutely, yeah. Here's the philosophy behind the whole thing. It's open. People will be able to create their own layers. We have some guidelines that we've created in terms of what we consider discourse that we are willing to host on our platform, and then a separate set of rules for things that we'll be willing to host in our public channel. I would not see a violation of our guidelines. Somebody creating a group with just terrible information in it. And so the way that we believe that this works is that the question number one is, you're on the page, you'll be able to discover that there are multiple groups with different perspectives. There may be on that same page a group of climate scientists that know what they're talking about, that have also weighed in. So you'll be able to see both perspectives. As opposed to just seeing one, which might be that skeptics page that you landed on because your friend posted in Facebook and said all things from one perspective and didn't include that other perspective. So from our perspective, letting people see those different channels, providing a lot of metrics about the reason why one channel might be dramatically more credible than another. And like, for instance, it might be just the number of people that are following that channel. Number two might be whether that channel has posted a code of conduct that stands the test of time. The credibility, the participation of the individual members, and what their bona fides are. But also, does the channel allow replies from non-members, moderated perhaps, to flow in as responses to their annotations? Do they allow perspectives from people that are outside of their zone of influence or whatever? So there's a lot of, this is all kind of greenfield for us. We need to experiment, see what works, partner with people that have solved some of these problems in terms of applying a lot of automation to the problems. Like there's a lot of Bayesian analysis you apply on annotations to see whether the toxicity score for a channel, how does it rate in terms of just the tempo or the style of discourse that they tend to use in their channel as an overall metric for the channel. So I think there's some powerful things techniques that we can use to get at some of that.
This is really great. And one of the strengths of it seems to be that it's a kind of central place for the things that I think a lot of us have been doing piecemeal, kind of like a kludge style. So, I've used the Genius annotator, the Chrome extension, and maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, the Institute for the Future of the Book had something called Social Book, which I used is really cool.
Project.
Yeah. So that's fantastic to be able to have all of those piecemeal things integrated into one place. I'm wondering, in terms of siloization that you mentioned, is there any kind of effort to communicate with those already existing?
Big time,
So you can,
yeah. So
have that?
our conference that we throw, we invite, Bob Stein has spoken probably 3 times there. Genius has come, presented 3 times on their project. So we kind of encourage everybody to come, compare notes. When we launched the working group at the W3C, we invited a lot of the people that were there. And, I think, the people that were clearly trying to solve this problem in a coordinated, community-based way showed up. The others, that weren't so interested or incentivized to be more open, tended to, show up or do a hit and run, but, not really participate over the long term.
So if I have, say, an annotation that I did with Genius, that I would be able to get to that through hypothesis, or is that?
Yeah, well, that is a question. It's a great question. 2 things. One is Genius is terminating their web annotator project. They're pivoting back to lyrics. But the larger question, I think, assuming that hadn't been the case, is that if, I think that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on them to essentially open their API so that their service, because there are 2 things, right? There are technology and a service. Their service can be discovered by other open annotation clients so that you could see the Genius annotation alongside the other one. If the world is starting to add annotation services that you can browse openly in a client, kind of like a web browser, but to see these other annotations, you've got to go get a special browser, and you can only see those annotations in that browser. It puts a tremendous amount of natural pressure on them to move to the standard.
Thanks very much. I've got a couple of questions about teaching applications. Given, it's not a core necessarily, but it's definitely something you guys are obviously very interested in. One is a pretty straightforward question about the fact that what you were showing us was browser integration on what looks like a fairly typical desktop or a laptop. What about other mobile devices?
It
The
works
extent
on
to which
mobile.
there's mobile integration.
There's a lot more that we can do to optimize it for mobile.
Yeah.
But it does work. There's a Firefox. Once we get our Firefox integration up, Firefox Mobile allows plugins, so you'll be able to have a version that you can create and make annotations on mobile. You can browse to annotations now if you're on your mobile device. If somebody sends a link to you. But there's really a lot more that can be done. Like, if I'm taking pictures with my phone, how come I can't tag them with the same tag set that I'm using, to tag my documents? Like maybe I'm actually taking a picture of a field sample for my research, and I should be able to tag it, along with the tag set that I'm using for the whole research project. And I should be able to do that right from within. So Apple's not going to integrate that into their iPhoto app, but we might be able to get a third-party app to do that first, and then force these guys to open up their system. It's actually surprising you can't tag photos in Apple iPhoto now. Astonishing to me. So there's a lot of mobile is a huge category. It represents just the narrowest bit is creating and viewing annotations, but there's really just a lot of potential applications.
The other question, thanks for that. The other question I had was about, you mentioned Canvas and the ways in which, say, it almost looked kind of like what you were describing was a copy and paste operation where you can go back and forth. But I'm wondering about the possibility of closer integration, and specifically just as someone who also wears an administrative hat and has to think about things like assessment, is it possible for the application to work with a CMS like Canvas to capture a level of student, like number of annotations or quality of annotations, something like that?
Yeah, we're starting to work on those. We've integrated with SpeedGrader in Canvas, so we've got at least the basics of assessment. But attention and other kinds of metrics, time on page, annotations, are all things that, are like definitely should, it's egregious that you can't get that information in Canvas now from this application. So those are on the roadmap. So come as soon as we can build them.
Just curious about, if say I make an annotation on a web page that then changes or disappears altogether. I'm guessing those annotations still exist in my user profile, but what do they link to at that point?
Yeah, so if you, so we have what's called orphans, and if you make an annotation, the text anchoring uses the selection of the sentence and then 32 bytes on either side of the sentence to dynamically re-anchor the annotation to the page. And that's why it works between HTML and PDF, because actually the text in HTML and PDF is not always exactly the same. Spaces are sometimes gone between words. Things break differently, but they're close enough that the edit distance tolerance of the algorithm is able to anchor them within, kind of, as long as there's 70% of the same material in the sentence there, which is also important for things like news articles, which change dramatically through the course of the day as the story breaks, and then they continue to go back and re-edit. But if it fails because it was on the second sentence and they ripped out the whole paragraph, and so it's just no chance, then it's orphaned. There's a separate channel on the sidebar, which only shows up if there are orphans on the page, and you can still see them. They're always in your profile, but you can see at least when you're on the page that there were some that didn't anchor. The cool project that we're working on, the Internet Archive is about to integrate Hypothesis into the Wayback Machine. So you'll be able to go into old versions of articles and annotate them. But the other part of the project that we're working on with them is that when you annotate, every time you annotate, it'll send, it'll ping what's called their Save Page API with the URL and tell it to go grab the page. And so if the page changes, they will have scanned the page within 5 minutes of when you originally made the annotation. And if the annotation orphans, you'll shortly be able to go say, take me to the archived version and re-anchor the annotation to the article the way it was when it was originally made. So that's becoming a bigger and bigger need for people. It's surprising how much of the web changes. It's something like every 40% of pages are dramatically different within 90 days, and within a year, something like 30% of all pages are gone. Crazy statistics like that. So it's a big deal. Something we're excited about. Rebecca.
Hi, thank you for that, Dan. So I think what's so exciting is to think there's limitless applications to this technology. And even when I think of a particular document, I think of the different ways that people might annotate and for different audiences. So for instance, if you have a climate science report or a Supreme Court decision, you can imagine how someone might annotate it for a very high-level, specialized audience, where someone else might want to annotate it so that the common man could understand something that's sort of complicated. So how could how would you parse those annotations, and how could you create ways where you go and find what you're looking for, the tone, the level? With Wikipedia, for instance, they really say write for a non-technical audience, write at an 8th grade level, spell out your acronyms. But with Hypothesis, that's not the purpose. It's not just for a general audience. It might be for a very specialized audience. Yeah. So how do you make that work?
Well, glad you asked. So Science in the Classroom, which is a AAAS project, is using, I've got this weird cursor thing going on. Is using Hypothesis to annotate articles for lay audiences. So this, I won't bother to go show you all this stuff, but they'll take a scholarly paper and then they'll annotate it so you can, I think, yeah, you can go and you can see that there's annotations. I can't mouse over to that, so I can't show you how cool it is. But you can see that the Hypothesis sidebar is on the right-hand side. And so this is in a layer of lay annotations targeted at a certain age range. So our thinking is maybe we can start to classify, like if you've created an annotation layer for a specific purpose and it's for instance, translation for different age ranges or something, we let you tag the group layer as being for a certain purpose, and then you could start to browse those sets of layers run by lots of different organizations, targeted at different types for all the interesting stuff that happened today that was targeted at a lay audience in, you know, neurobiology or something like that. Awesome, thanks.
How soon do you think we will start seeing support for annotations in the browser natively?
So we're talking to Mozilla. They have a project called Test Pilot. Test Pilot is a cohort of 100,000 users that test new concepts that would be brought in typically via plugin, but they're candidates for being made native. So our goal is to see, now that our Firefox plugin is almost done, which is probably a requirement for that, and then to work with them over the next year to say, you know, what makes a successful test pilot run. We want to make sure we're kind of well prepared for that. We need to get all the multi-auth backend stuff done so that we're not asking them to bake Hypothesis, the service, into the browser, only the open client. So I guess my guess would be, say, 3 years maybe, but we could probably, for the majors, but there's probably a few others like Brave that we might be able to do a little bit sooner, or just roll our own, you know, just take a WebKit or Chromium or something like that and just make a copy that's got the annotation client in it.
Everybody's finished. If there's like one more question, maybe we can take that, but we do need to get Dan on a plane. So